Hello. We're going to start chapter 2 today, which is on chemistry. So we're going to go through, and so let's get this down into our notes. Start off with here. So this is chapter 2, and we're going to cover this as it applies to this class, human anatomy and physiology. So this is not a chemistry class, but we do need to understand some chemistry in order to understand how the human body works. So what we're going to cover, to begin with, the first thing we're going to talk about is water. And one of the reasons we're going to talk about water is because it's so important for our body. We've already looked at our fluid body compartments, and we've seen how the fluid in our body is divided up into different regions and compartments. So we're going to take a look at water on the level of chemistry to try to understand why this is such an important part of our body. Then we're going to look at the compounds of life. And those are going to fall into two broad categories: inorganic compounds. We'll talk a little bit about them. Talk a little bit about their properties. And we'll also at the same time look at these ways in which we can mix a fluid with solid materials, solutions, colloids, and suspensions. Each of these is a combination of some fluid, and dissolved in that fluid is some combination of solutes, ions, number of different things. And each one of these things you will run into. We talk a lot about solutions in this class. We talk a little bit less than solutions about colloids, and even less about suspensions. But we need to know and understand what each of those three things are. So, and that's going to fall under the discussion of inorganic compounds. And then we're going to look at organic compounds. And here we're going to look at the organic compounds that you are composed of. And we're going to confine our discussion to the three major macromolecules that you are composed of, which would be carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So these first three are very important. Now, this one is important too, but we talk about that a lot less in this class. This, of course, is what we're talking about, is DNA and RNA. So we're going to briefly touch on that. We're not going to spend a lot of time there. But these three right here, those are very important. And you'll be talking about those in one way or another throughout most of the rest of your stay in this class, as well as 40B and 40C. So let's begin. And as I said, we're going to start talking about water first and talk a little bit of why that's an important element in our body. So let's begin that discussion. So water. Okay. As you know, water you are composed of between 55 and 60% of your is water. And we're going to divide that water in our body into three major compartments. So if we look at those compartments, we're going to look at blood plasma. We're going to look at interstitial. Fluid. and we're going to look at intracellular fluid. And I deliberately drew this in this fashion that you see here because blood plasma is confined by or confined within the circulatory system. So we have here the blood vessels, and we're going to talk about, in this case, a special type of blood vessel, which is the capillary. And then the interstitial fluid, as you know, surrounds the cells. And within the cells, and this is the membrane, so this is our cell membrane. And so we talked about this quite a bit. So things are going to be exchanged between blood plasma and interstitial fluid. We're going to control this body of fluid, and the exchange is going to take place between the blood plasma and interstitial fluid. And then whatever the cells need or get or want to get rid of, that's going to take place between the intracellular fluid and the interstitial fluid. So this is kind of a review of what we've been talking about. So why are we talking about water? Because both or all three of these compartments that we've got here, the main constituents is water. So water is playing a really important role in our bodies. And so it really is important that we understand the nature of water and how it behaves and what the properties are based on how water is put together as a molecule. So let's just go through and make a list of why water is important. So the importance of water. What kinds of things does it do for us? So there's a couple things. First of all, just some fun facts. Water is the most important inorganic substance in our body. Okay. Number two, it's the most abundant inorganic substance in our body. So it's very important. In fact, it's the most important substance in our body. It's also the most abundant substance in our body. So just for those two reasons by themselves, it's important we understand how water is put together and how it behaves. But there are other reasons. So we can also say that it acts as a medium for. So it's going to be the thing in which the following things that we're going to list happen. So it's a medium of, number one, and we'll just call this, one, all chemical reactions within the body. So our total metabolism is happening inside or within water. It is also a place where we dissolve stuff. And here we're going to put quotations around stuff just to indicate that it's an important scientific word. Number three, it transports stuff. So stuff is referring to a lot of different things. Ions, nutrients, hormones, of proteins, amino acids, a lot of different things are being dissolved within water and transported by water. Okay. So this just give you a kind of an idea of why we need to talk about water. But let's go ahead and expand a little bit on this idea of why water is important and talk about the important properties of water. So what is it about water that makes it so important? What properties does it have? So let's go ahead and we're going to make that list, and then we'll start looking at each one of these properties in more detail. So important properties of water. Important properties of water. All right. We're going to list them, and then we'll go into the details. Number one, it is a good solvent. Well, a lot of things can dissolve in water, which is very beneficial to us. It's a good thing that happens because we need to dissolve a lot of things and transport them within our body. Okay. It participates in chemical reactions. Okay. So it's part of chemical reactions. We'll talk about that. Number three, it has this property. It has a high heat capacity. And we'll talk about what that is when we get into the details. But that's a very important property, and it's often overlooked as we look at water and try to understand it. And number four is water is a good lubricant. We'll talk about this as well and expand on this in a little more detail as we get into each one of these different properties. Okay? So let's begin at the start, which is water is a good solvent. So we'll start that. Water as a solvent. And at this point, what we really need to do is look at how the water molecule is put together, because we are not really going to understand most of these important properties that we've listed here unless we understand how the molecule is put together and what that means for the behavior of that molecule. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some overhead, some slides, and we're going to just see how water is put together. As you know, we can represent water in this formula, H2O. And as I'm sure you know, that means we have 2 hydrogens plus 1 oxygen. Okay, so that's the formula. Those are the atoms that make up water. Let's take a look at how they combine together to create a water molecule. So very quickly, I'm going to move this over here, and when I'm going to come to this sheet here. All right. So here we're looking at, and let's put that in English so we can read it. There we go. All right, so here we have an oxygen molecule. We have 2 hydrogen molecules. We're going to combine them together to create one molecule. So here's my 2 hydrogens here and here, and there's the oxygen. And I want to call your attention to this area right here. Notice there's a minus sign right there, and there's a plus sign right there. And in fact, there's a plus sign up here as well. So what's going on here? Well, this is a covalent bond between the 2 hydrogens and the oxygen molecule. That means that they are sharing electrons. And here's one of those electrons. There's the other one. And so for oxygen to be happy, we have to add 2 electrons to this outer shell. And they're going to come right there. So we're going to add those 2. And now what's happening is we're sharing these electrons that came from the hydrogen with the water, with the oxygen. And the same thing over here. But the sharing of these electrons is not equal. The oxygen molecule grabs onto these electrons more tightly than the hydrogen atoms. So what happens is you set up polarity. You set up polarity. This is called a polar molecule. So let's go back and put that information in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to, water is a polar molecule. And we're going to go ahead and draw. Here's my oxygen. And here are my two hydrogens. And what we're going to get is we're going to get negative here, positive here, positive here. So if I were drawing a line through here, if I had something that worked, there we go, then I would have a positive side of a positive side over here and a negative side over there. Okay, so this would be positive. This would be negative. Okay. And that makes that water molecule a polar molecule. Now, what does that mean? Well, we just explained that. It means that this molecule has a negative side to it and a positive side. These sides are charged. This is a negative charge and a positive charge. The one molecule is like it's bipolar, split personality. On one side of it, there's a negative charge. On the other side, there's a positive charge. Okay? And that's how this water molecule is set up. Now, it's important to understand that this charge does not mean that there are more negative charges than there are positive charges. That's not what it means. It means that the charges, they have the same number of negative charges and the same number of positive charges. They're equal. Positive and negative charges equal each other within the overall molecule. But the arrangement of those charges are polar. So one way to think about this is if you have a classroom that's filled with equal number of men and equal number of women. If you mix them all up randomly in the room, there would be no polarity because the genders would be all mixed up in a random way. However, if you organize the men in one corner and the females and the women in another side of the room, then there would be polarity. Even though the room itself contains the same number of males and females, they're equal to each other in terms of numbers, they're segregated. They are polarized. They're on separate parts of the room, and that's exactly what's happening here. So we have negative side, a negative charge over here, and a positive charge over there. All right, so why am I making this big deal about this? That's a good question. And let's talk about that. So when that happens, the negative and positive sides of a water molecule can set up different types of interactions. So let's talk about that. So when we have water, when we have a group of molecules creating, I'm getting to get this. There you go. Now I got it. It only takes me 20 years to figure out how these things work. So when you have several molecules interacting, what they're going to do is they're going to align themselves so that one water molecule, the negative side of that one water molecule, will associate itself with the positive side of another water molecule. They'll create this interaction. They will create this bond. It's called a hydrogen bond. It's a relatively weak bond, but it is a bond. So they're attracted to each other through the fact that positive charges are attracted to negative charges. And the same thing's going on here. So every single water molecule in a beaker of water is interacting with its neighbor in the fashion that we're seeing in this picture right here. So what does that mean? What is the significance of having something like this occur? Well, one way to look at this is to think about two beakers. And one beaker is filled with marbles, glass marbles. And another beaker is filled with round magnets. And if you know anything about magnets, magnets have a north and south pole. And the north pole of one end of a magnet is attracted to the south pole of another. There's an attractive force. And if you bring the two magnets together, they will attract each other. They will stick to each other. If you try to take a north pole and touch them together with magnets, they repel each other. It's very difficult to do. Very hard to do. So what you do is you pour these round magnets into the beaker, and automatically they'll arrange themselves so that the south end of one magnet is going to associate with the north end of another magnet. There will be this attractive force between them. All right, so we have these two beakers, one filled with glass marbles, the other filled with round magnets. And you want to reach in and pull out one marble and one magnet. So in the case of the beaker with the marbles, you can reach in and easily remove one of those marbles, because the glass marbles are not attracted to each other. They are separate. They don't have any interaction. So it's very easy to reach in and grab one of those marbles and pull it out. However, if you went to the beaker that's filled with the magnets and you tried to grab one of them and pull it out, you would feel resistance. You would feel that there was a resistance to that act. It would be hard to pull out one of those magnets because it's connected to another magnet, which is connected to another one, which is connected to another. And you would have a difficult time pulling out just one. Well, that's what's going on here in a beaker of water. Because of these interactions here, these hydrogen bonds, one water molecule is attracted to another through the connection of the positive side and the negative side of each of these things. And so it'd be very hard, actually, for a water molecule to escape the beaker. It would be hard because it has to overcome the hydrogen bonds, the attractive forces of these hydrogen bonds. Okay? And what we're going to see is that interaction between the negative and positive side of water molecules has certain ramifications. It means certain things. And we'll talk about what those are as we get through that list that we just talked about: the good solvent, chemical reactions, high heat capacity, and a lubricant. We'll talk about these. But this goes further, because if you take another molecule, which is not a water molecule, and put it in water, something very, very interesting happens. And so let's talk about that. And what we're going to do is we're now going to start with water is a good solvent. So water as a good solvent. Okay. So we'll talk about that. What does that mean? Well, we've already explained how water interacts. And if we take now, here we go. See if I can do this right the first time. Oh, yay, I did it. All right, so here we are. We're going to take some salt and we're going to put it in a beaker of water. So here's our salt. And as you probably know, salt is composed of two atoms, a sodium ion and a chloride ion. Now notice that they are charged. So there's a charge. There's a positive charge here and a negative charge right there. Okay. And also remember that water has a negative side and a positive side. Now think about this. You know that water, the molecules are attracted to each other because the positive side of one water molecule is going to be attracted to the negative side of another. But what happens if we don't use water? What if we have something that has a charge, such as a sodium ion or a chloride ion? Well, what's going to happen is when you drop this salt into the water, the molecules which are attracted through ionic bonds will disassociate. So they will break apart because the ionic bonds are not weak enough to hold them together in a salt crystal when you put it in water. And so what you will see with this positively charged sodium is that it becomes surrounded by water molecules who are facing in with their negative side. So negative, 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 negative. Okay? And so that then dissolves the positively charged sodium ion. The same kinds of things are happening with the chloride. So you take the sodium crystal, place it in water, and now the negatively charged chloride ion is surrounded by water molecules, but this time it's the positive side of water molecules that dissolve it and surround it. So you can get both the sodium and the chloride dissolved in water because of the nature of the water molecule having one positive side and one negative side. Because the water molecule is polar, it can easily dissolve charged molecules such as chloride and sodium. Okay, so let's talk about that. So water is a good solvent for, number one, ionized substances. What do we mean by ionized substances? Well, sodium, chloride, calcium, and any number of other ionized molecules that you can think of. If they have a charge, they can be dissolved in water because of what we just explained, the nature of water having a positive and a negative side. Number two, water becomes a good solvent for polar molecules or polar substances. What do we mean, polar? Well, we were already explaining water is a polar substance. So if there's another molecule with the same characteristic of water, where there's a negative side to it and a positive side to it, you're going to be able to dissolve that. One example would be sugars. They are polar. And because they are polar, they can dissolve in water quite easily. And I'm going to add a third thing to our list. And it's not quite kosher, but let me write it down and I'll explain exactly what I mean. So, molecules with charges. Molecules with charges. What am I talking about? I'm talking about proteins. So a protein is a very, very large molecule, usually, typically. And not all of that molecule, that very large molecule, is going to be charged. But certain parts of it will have charges. Certain parts of it will have a negative charge associated. So another side will have a positive charge. So essentially, we could have put it in this category, polar substances, because that's basically what we're describing, but I'm pulling it out and emphasizing it because they're very large molecules, unlike sugars, which don't tend to be very large. These are very large. And so you can have, I'm just going to draw, let's just say this is a protein, large, and it may have one positive charge over here and a negative charge over there, but most of it has no charges associated at all. But as long as it has these charges, it's going to be dissolved in water. And I'm just pulling it out because I think it's important to emphasize that these molecules can be very large. They don't have to be, the entire molecule doesn't have to be polar or charged. Only small parts of it need to be charged or polar for it to be dissolvable in water. Okay. So water is a good solvent for a lot of different things. But is it a good solvent for everything? No. There are some things, as you sure are aware of, don't dissolve in water at all. So let's write this down. Not a good solvent for molecules. I don't know why I'm trying to either. Molecules with non-polar covalent bonds. Well, that's a mouthful. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about fats, about lipids. So these are very large molecules, and they're held together by covalent bonds, and they have no polarity. And these things will not dissolve in water. Okay. Now, the molecules that can dissolve in water, the molecules that you can easily put in water and they dissolve in water, they have a special name. And these molecules, the name that we apply to these molecules is that they are hydrophilic. Meaning they are water-loving. Water-loving. The molecules which do not dissolve in water, which you cannot mix with water, these molecules have a different name, and these are hydrophobic. Water hating. Okay. All right, so water then becomes a good medium in which we can dissolve things. As long as they fit this description, they will dissolve in water. And so what kinds of things do we use or do we need in our body that fit this description? It turns out there's quite a few molecules. Let's take a very quick look at those types of molecules. Okay. All right. So water is a medium to dissolve number one, reactants in chemical reactions. So it turns out that many of the molecules that are part of our metabolism, oh my God, I can't believe this. I'm not going to go there. Many of the molecules that are involved in chemical reactions are metabolism. Finally. That's the problem with getting old. So many of the molecules that are part of our metabolism are substances that are ionized or have charges and are polar. So that makes them perfect for being dissolved in water, and the chemical reaction then can take place within that medium, water. Okay? Nutrients. So many of the nutrients that we need in our body are dissolvable in water, and just one example, sugars. Okay. I said one, I lied to you. Proteins. Okay. And there are many others that we could put in this list. I don't want to make a complete list. But so the things that we need to supply the cells with energy and building blocks, those can be dissolved in water. Okay. Number 3, gases. What type of gases? In particular, we're talking about water and nitrogen. Oxygen and nitrogen. These are dissolvable in water. Okay. So that's good because we need the oxygen to be transported. I could add another one here, carbon dioxide. We need oxygen to be transported to our cells. So it's a good thing that it can be dissolved in water. Okay. And finally, the 4th thing on our list would be waste products. Urea is a good example of that. So many of the waste products that our body produces can be dissolved in water. Again, a good thing because we can then transport it to the appropriate organ and get rid of it through the mechanisms that are available in our body. All right, so it's a good medium to dissolve things in. What else? Well, let's talk about the second thing in our list. If you recall, the second thing in our list was chemical reactions. So let's talk about chemical reactions. All right, so we'll put down a statement, and then we'll have to give a little bit of background and talk about this. So chemical reactions. So water is the medium in which all chemical reactions in our body take place. Okay. It holds the reactants together. So if two molecules need to come together to interact, water is going to carry them, support them, is the network in which they are found so that they can find and react with one another. So the medium in which all chemical reactions in our body take place. It is also a participant. In chemical reactions. Not all, but many chemical reactions in our body require water to be present in order for the reaction to take place. Not just to carry the molecules, to hold them as they're reacting, but actually participating in that reaction. Now, let's talk about this idea a little bit. And to do that, we have to understand two different types of reactions. So we're going to talk about two types of reactions, and they are, number one, hydrolysis, and number two, dehydration, synthesis, reactions. Okay, let's take a look at each one of those. So, let's say we're going to do first. Okay, so let's take a look at hydrolysis. Well, let's first look at the word lysis and hydro. Hydrolysis. So hydro refers to water, lysis refers to break apart. To break apart water, that's what that word means. Okay, well, let's take a look at see what we're talking about. So I'm going to remove this. I'll come back to this in just a moment. Take a look. So here we go. We'll take a look at this. So hydrolysis of a polymer. Polymer is a large molecule composed of many subunits, all of which can be the same. So at the top of the image, you see 1, 2, 3, 4 blue dots. They could be anything, amino acids, whatever, doesn't really matter. And what we want to do is we want to break off that last one. We want to remove this last blue dot from the string of dots. If we're going to do that reaction, we need water to be part of that reaction. So when we break it apart, what we end up with after the reaction is we have a string of just 3 blue dots and a single blue dot by itself. But notice what happened to water. Water was split apart. It was lysed. Water was lysed. So we take water, we split it apart. So here's one of the hydrogen atoms, and there is the other and the oxygen. So we break that bond, and then we break water apart. We add one of the hydrogens to one side and the OH group to the other, and we have separated the blue dots. That's a hydrolysis reaction. Okay. So let's go ahead and do a quick little drawing in our notes to capture that information. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically draw the same drawing that the textbook has. So we're going to do this, and let's go ahead and give ourselves some dots here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to have one. Okay, and we're going to have H here. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to bring in some water. We're going to have a reaction, and we're going to get, in the end, this. And I'm going to do this in red so we can H, and over here HO. Okay, so there is our water. And as I said, this is hydrolysis reaction. Where does this happen? Well, this happens quite a bit. And one of the best examples would be your digestive tract. So you're consuming very large molecules, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and you want to break those down in order to absorb them across the gut wall. In order for that to happen, you have to have water. So one of the things that happens while you're digesting food is your body dumps large amounts of water into your digestive tract. It takes water from other areas of the body and puts it into the digestive tract, into the small intestine, into the stomach. And these reactions happen. So you take the very large molecules you've consumed and you slowly break them down using the water. So the water is reabsorbed, but not as a water molecule, as part of some other larger molecule that you have broken apart. Okay. So that's your hydrolysis reaction. What's the other one? Dehydration synthesis. Dehydration synthesis. So this is to make, and this is to remove water. You make something as you remove water. And as you can imagine, it's basically the opposite of the reaction we just identified. So let's go back and let's take a look at this. So another term that you will often see is a condensation synthesis, or as we are calling it, dehydration synthesis. Okay. So here we have 3 dots. We want to add a dot. Remember, there's our water, OH, and a hydrogen. What we're going to do is we're going to link this blue dot to these 3 blue dots. To do that, we have to remove these 2 things. We create a water molecule, and we have the larger polymer. Okay, so that's a condensation or a dehydration synthesis reaction. Well, let's go ahead and capture that information into our notes. And we'll basically do the same thing as we've just done with our notes. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab, we're going to get, okay, and we're going to have HO, connect these here, and we're going to have H here, and we're going to have HO here, okay, and a hydrogen here, and we're going to bring these 2 together. There you go. And we're going to remove water and have, in the end, 1, 2, 3. Plus H2O. So there H2O. Okay. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the dehydration. Synthesis reaction. Where does this happen? Well, remember all those very large molecules you broke down while you're digesting your food and brought into your body? Well, now they are composed of very simple molecules. A protein is now composed of amino acids. It's broken apart, and we've taken in the amino acids. Now you want to build a protein. You need a protein somewhere in your body. You're going to take those amino acids and you're going to put them together to make a protein. And as you do that, you're extracting out the water that you put into those large proteins that you consumed and brought into your body. The water that's attached to those amino acids are now is extracted back out, and you're getting that water back. Okay. All right. So it's a participant in chemical reactions that are happening in your body, and these are very important chemical reactions. And I only gave you a few examples, but it happens over and over and over again inside your body, in many different places and in many different types of reactions. Okay? But they fit into one of those patterns. Either you're going to remove water or you're going to need water for the reaction to go forward. All right. Let's talk about the third item or important property, and that is has a high heat capacity. High heat capacity of water. So the way we're going to define this is that water can absorb or release large amounts of heat energy with little change in its own temperature. So water can absorb or release large amounts of heat energy without or with little change in its own temperature. Now let me give you a good example of this. Not part of the human body, but still a good example. So, as you know, we live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there's a huge body of water, it's called the San Francisco Bay, that sits very close to most of the cities that make up the San Francisco Bay Area. Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco, all these different cities. Okay. So during the day, the sun is out, it's beating down on the earth, and there's a lot of heat energy that's being transferred to the surface of the earth here in the Bay Area by the sun as it beats down on the earth. So, as you know, we have fairly mild weather here, and let's compare our area, San Francisco Bay Area, the cities that surround this large body of water. We call it San Francisco Bay. Let's compare that to just over the mountains, just over the hills on the other side. Walnut Creek, Concord, those places. So only miles apart. And if you were to, on a typical summer day, measure the air temperature, let's say in Oakland, and then go through the tunnels, go to the other side of the hills, and into Walnut Creek, Lafayette, Concord, the temperature could be 10, 20, even higher degrees different or higher than Oakland. Why? It's the same sun. We're sitting relatively close to each other. Why is Concord so much hotter than Oakland on a typical day? And the answer to that is this body of water that we call the San Francisco Bay. So what's happening is all that energy that's coming from the sun a large part of that is being soaked into or stored into this very large body of water we call the San Francisco Bay. If you were to measure the temperature of the San Francisco Bay, it would not change. It would not change. On the very top surface, you might see a slight change if you had a very sensitive thermometer, but basically it would not change. And yet, it's receiving a lot of heat energy. It's absorbing that heat energy. Now, over in Concord, there is no body of water. And so all that heat that's coming from the sun, all that heat energy from the sun, is going to go into the landmass and the surrounding structures. There's nothing to absorb it. You're going to feel it. It's going to get hot. It's going to get hotter in Concord than it would in Oakland. And then the sun sets. And so the sun's no longer there supplying heat energy. And what happens typically is the temperatures around in Concord will fall quite dramatically sometimes. It's quite possible if you're in the desert, for example, to have temperatures well over 100 and at night be freezing. The same day. In the San Francisco Bay Area, there's not going to be a big change in difference in temperature from the evening to the night, typically, without outside weather considerations. So why is that? Because, again, the San Francisco Bay has absorbed all this heat energy during the day, and at night when the sun goes down, it releases that energy back into the atmosphere. And so it stores the energy during the day and releases it at night. So that's an example of the high heat capacity of water. Now, how does this apply to the humans? Very dramatic example, sweat. Right? Humans have evolved to control core body temperature with a number of different mechanisms. One of the most important mechanisms is that we produce heat. Okay? So we have sweat glands. And these sweat glands produce water that sits on the surface of our skin. And when that water evaporates, it removes large amounts of heat energy. Remember that example of the beakers and the marbles and the beaker full of magnets? Well, our water sitting on the surface is like that beaker of magnets. So when the heat surrounding us in the environment goes in and tries to remove a water molecule, it has to overcome those hydrogen bonds that are causing the water molecules in that surface of moisture on our skin to hold together. They want to hold on to each other. So you have to put a lot of energy in there. You have to remove a lot of energy from our body to get that water to evaporate and become a gas. And as it evaporates, that energy that you put into it to break those hydrogen bonds is removed from our body. Very important thing. Now, to illustrate just how important this idea is, consider the fact that we as mammals don't have fur. So if you look around the world, 99.9% of all mammals have some sort of fur covering their body. Why don't we as humans do? We have some hair, but we don't have fur. What happened? Well, one of the leading hypotheses as to what happened, why we became what they call the naked ape, that is, we don't have fur, is because by getting rid of our fur, we were able to take advantage of this idea of sweat. So what's happening here, and this is a hypothesis, is we lost our fur, that covering of hair. By doing that, and by growing a lot more sweat glands than other mammals. So particularly in our head, we have a huge amount of sweat glands, much more than any other mammal. And by doing that, we were able to operate in very high temperature areas, like the savanna in Africa. So we were able to cool our body down when other animals were not capable of doing that. And the reason people think that this happened was because we were able then to hunt during the middle of the day. Whereas other animals, if you go out to Africa in the middle of a very hot day, you will notice that many of the animals are seeking shade, they're sitting, they're quiet. So we as humans can walk around in this heat because we have the capacity to reduce body heat. Now fur impedes that ability. So if you have a covering of fur and you put a lot of water on the surface of your skin, that fur is acting as an insulating layer, and it's preventing that water from evaporating. So in order for this to be effective, you got to get rid of the fur and then have that water easily evaporate, removing heat. And so the idea was that we could hunt game in the middle of the day. So we became specialists at hunting game in the middle of the day when it was hot. So we would go out in groups because we're a social animal. We hunted in packs. We would find a wildebeest or some other animal that we wanted to eat, and we would disturb it, chase it. The animal would get up and run. Of course, it was faster than us. We couldn't keep up, but we were good trackers. So it would run until it got hot and tired. Then it would sit down and rest, and we would track it. And as we caught up with it, it would have to run again, and this would be repeated over and over. And finally, the animal would just simply be exhausted, from heat exhausted, and fall down and be helpless. And that's when we'd move in to kill it. So we were able to hunt game in the middle of the day, much larger game, much more dangerous game than us, because of this ability to sweat. So high heat capacity is something that we take advantage of in controlling our body temperature. Okay. The last thing is water as a lubricant. So water is being used throughout the body to lubricate movement, to make it easier for body parts to move. So what we do is we produce a substance called mucus. And mucus is mostly composed of water. Has some polysaccharides in there and a variety of other molecules, some lipids and things, but mostly it's composed of water. And it's used to lubricate. It's a lubricant. We have talked about serous membranes. And they produce a serous fluid. Again, this is basically water, and it's acting as a lubricant. So when the heart beats inside the sac that contains the heart is beating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's moving vigorously. And if we didn't lubricate that movement, there would be damage to the surface of the heart. So we're going to lubricate that, and most of what we're using to lubricate it is water. So we use it to lubricate body parts as they move against one another. A heart is one example. Another example would be the digestive tract, the small intestines. As you know, if you looked at any picture inside the human, they're all packed closely together, but they're in constant movement. They're grinding and moving all the time. And if there weren't something lubricating that movement as they brushed against each other, as they moved against themselves, then there would be abrasive damage. And so we have to lubricate that in order for that to happen without damage. Synovial joints, the movement of your joints, also lubrication. So synovial fluid is another example of how we use this to lubricate. All these are examples of fluids, specialized fluids to be sure, that we find in the human body which are used to lubricate things. Food, the movement of food through the digestive tract, sex, all of these different things that we do is being lubricated by water. Let me give you one example of how good water is as a lubricant. So I used to have a friend that lived in Sacramento, and I would go visit her quite a bit, and I would take the train from Emeryville to Sacramento, and it was a nice ride. If you haven't taken it, you should take it. It's a great ride. It's a very unique view of the bay. But anyway, so this particular day, it was raining, light rain, and I think it was one of the first rains of the season. As the train was pulling into Davis, so the Davis is the bus stop or the train stop just before Sacramento. The conductor or the engineer of the train applied the brakes. Now he applied the brakes where he normally would apply the brakes to stop the train, so that it was actually sitting in the Davis train station, so people could get off and on. Well, he applied the brakes, but what he forgot was that there was a layer of water on the tracks because it had just been raining, and I could hear this happening. I could look out the window and see this happening, and so I could hear the brakes being applied, and the train was again. You can hear the train, and it slid right through that station and past the station. And there was a moment of silence. And then you could hear the engines reversing, and the train had to back up and come back into the Davis station. Well, the reason that happened is because that surface water on the tracks was acting as a lubricant. The train brakes and the wheels couldn't get any traction to stop, and it just slid right through the train station before it came to a stop. So, an example of the power of lubrication of water. Okay. So the next lecture that we're going to do is on the compounds of life, and I will see you when we come back and talk about the compounds of life.